What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and we got some phenomenal news in a Warhammer community article today. This article was about the new Eldari Codex and how great it is, and how this ancient and noble civilization has some of the most powerful abilities Warhammer 40k has ever seen. But we don't care about any of that. Get out of here, pointy-eared elves, because the little footnote at the bottom said that after the craft worlds are released, there are going to be some new quote-unquote gribbly and chitinous releases coming, specifically Tyranids. There's also a link there that goes to nowhere. It's a blank page in the Games Workshop website. I don't know if that's going to be occupied by something at some point in the future, but anyway, new Tyranid stuff is being released. Whether or not this is a new codex isn't completely confirmed, but it's definitely sounding like that, especially given that even as long ago as almost a year back, we've been getting rumors of the new Tyranid codex coming out. I guess it's only a matter of time until those rumors come true, to be fair, because every codex gets released every new edition, but the tenor of the announcement definitely seems like it is a new codex or a wide release, not just a single individual model release. So I figured that with that in mind, what we talk about today is maybe some rampant speculation, a little bit of a wish listing, perhaps, about new Tyranid releases in the not-too-distant future, as well as some speculation about the time frame that we could be seeing this release post-Eldari Codex. Now, in terms of time frame, we've been getting codexes at a rate of about one per month over the last couple of months. They've been packaged together, typically, so like we saw Adeptus Custodes and Janestealer cults, as well as Grey Knights and Thousand Sons released together, and what are probably going to be Eldari and what I assume to be Chaos Space Marines, given that they are the opposite end of the newest book coming out. Supply chain issues notwithstanding, those dual releases are coming out at the rate of about one every 2 months, which means that, assuming that we get Eldari in February, I would expect to be seeing the next stage of codexes released somewhere in late March or April. Now, this begs the question whether or not a codex will be released in a dyad like these other ones have been, which I have to imagine it will be, because almost all the other codexes have been released in that manner. I think it's pretty likely we see something like Imperial Guard paired up with Tyranids, because those are two age-old foes that are often fighting each other in the lore. I think it would be very appropriate to get a Tyranid versus Imperial Guard boxed set. Not to mention the fact that I think Imperial Guard are one of the factions in the game most in need of an updated codex. Interestingly, in my opinion, I don't actually think or honestly even want a new Tyranid codex. I know, as somebody who makes YouTube videos talking mostly about Tyranids, a new Tyranid codex is very good for me. Not only will I get exciting new rules to play with and probably win games with more easily than the current rules. I mean, who knows? The current Tyranids are pretty good. But also I'll be able to make a lot of videos about them and talk and explore new Tyranid builds and all that stuff. But to be honest, there are other factions in the game that I feel need a codex more than Tyranids. I already mentioned Astra Militarum, but I also think Chaos Demons, as well as the Knight duo, need touching much more than Tyranids do, and I would prefer to have those codex updated before Tyranids. I think Tyranids are in a good spot right now with their recent releases of the Leviathan supplement, as well as Crusher Stampede. It doesn't feel to me like Tyranids are in need of a redux because of all of the supplemental materials they've been getting, but their codex is old and it does sort of need some cleanup. And it may be the fact that the faction is being propped up by these extra materials as the reason for their re-release. So anyway, let's talk about a little bit of a wish list that I'd like to posit for rules in a new Tyranid codex. Currently, Tyranid lists basically fall into one of two categories. You either have a Crusher Stampede list that just is a bunch of tough monsters that do 1 billion points of damage, and then you also have lists that have guns in them, mostly Hive Guard, whether it's 1 or 2 or even 3 units of Hive Guard, typically backed up by a smattering of melee stuff, either from Janestealer cult as allies, or bringing in some classic Tyranid melee-like monsters, or typically alongside Devour or Termagants. Those are kind of the only two builds that Tyranids have right now, and while I think having two builds that are both very strong and are both very competitively viable and offer very different playstyles is a lot more than can be said for a lot of other factions, I do think I would like to see a tone down, at the very least, of units like Hive Guard. The Crusher Stampede game plan is also kind of boring, and in the games that I've played with it so far, while it is, pretty fun and it does offer a lot of interesting options, and definitely playing with the big monsters is pretty cool, a lot of games with Crusher Stampede come down to a stat check of whether or not your opponent is able to deal with toughness 8 monsters with damage reduction and invulnerable saves up the wazoo. If they can't, They lose, and if they can, you lose, and that's the whole game. And I think that style of gameplay is not really what I'm here to play Tyranids for. As much as I like Crusher Stampede, I would like to see both that and the indirect fire portions of the faction toned down a little. Now that said, I would like to see some buffs elsewhere in the Codex. The Crusher Stampede benefits make a lot of Tyranid monsters much more playable. I think even such monsters as Tyrannifexes and Carnifexes are worth playing in Crusher Stampede to a limited extent, and I would like to see those buffs rolled into the standard datasheet of these monsters to allow them to fit into a more varied game plan and a wider variety of lists without having to just saddle them with something like Crusher Stampede. I'd like to be able to play units like Trigons and Carnifexes and all this stuff in my other lists alongside my infantry and my smaller bugs. That would just be great. Along those lines, I'd like to see Carnifexes entirely reworked as a unit. I've talked about it a lot in the past, but I think the way to make Carnifexes work as a unit archetype would be to return them to units rather than running individual Carnifexes and having that unit that you bring split off into a trio. Allow them to remain in their unit so that any buffs that you apply to them are applied to 3 Carnifexes rather than just 1. I think that would alone make Carnifexes worth looking at. Alongside some stat increases or points cost reductions, you could see Carnifexes work very well. It seems to me like the way Tyranids are going to be working in the future is going to be a faction along the lines of Adeptus Mechanicus, whereas a particular unit has buffs concentrated onto it, whether they're from stratagems or passive auras or abilities like Synaptic Links that are targeted in the command phase. Then that unit is supercharged up to super powerful levels and sent off to go do whatever. That's essentially how Crusher Stampede works, and that's a playstyle that's facilitated by the Synaptic Link abilities we got in Woezar and Octarius. It also makes sense thematically, where the hive mind is more powerful, where you have more units concentrated on the table because they can all apply their buffs individually, and once you start removing those pieces from the synaptic web, things start to fall apart for the army. But individual models, like small monsters and stuff like that, don't really work with that game plan, so I'd like to see them rolled up into larger units. Speaking of larger units, I'd also like to see Horde mode, Gaunt Carpet, that style of list become playable in the new version. Currently, styles of lists like this have gotten a lot of help from Synaptic Links and from the High Fleet Leviathan stratagem, but it's mostly restricted to taking a bunch of Devourer Termagants and stacking buffs on them. I'd like to see the ability to play a wide variety of different Termagant and Hormagant builds and play a lot of them together also be effective. Maybe have core unit keyworded buffs be able to affect in an aura, whereas other buffs are more targeted to be able to impact a lot of different Tormagants or Hormagants all at once. These units would also have to be made more dangerous and probably slightly more resilient on top of that. Units like Hormagants or non-Devourer Termagants hit dramatically below their points value, and while they can be buffed up to deal a bunch of damage, unfortunately, oftentimes it's not really worth the effort, and you'd be better off buffing units like Genestealers. That's unfortunate. And while I don't know if I would like to see that style of list become the most powerful list in Tyranids, because sort of logistically it's annoying to play and introduces a similar stat check to something like Crusher Stampede, the fact that it's such an integral part of the faction's backstory means that it definitely should be at least viable to some extent. That said, alongside all those changes, I'd also like to see some stuff remain the same. For example, I'd like to see the current playstyle of Tyranids, which is much more of a hit-and-run style, and I personally would be very upset if the current iteration of Tyranids is reworked, and I personally would be very upset if the way Tyranids play currently is entirely gone out of a new codex. I like to compare the current version of Tyranids to playing something like a Xenomorph from Aliens, rather than a Horde mode like you see Zerg or the bugs from Starship Troopers. Tyranids right now are most effective when implementing surgical strikes, being able to put a lot of their power behind removing your opponent's key pieces or sort of sandpapering them off in an attritional game before running away back into the shadows of obscuring terrain, back into cover or into reserve to hit them again next turn and slowly pull their guys away into the darkness and gantries up above in the space station hangar deck. I'd like to see some of the more hit-and-run focused Tyranid phenotypes see a bunch of buffs. Units like Lictors being used as little nuclear missiles and trading pieces I think could be interesting, as well as the big monsters like Hive Tyrants, Winged Hive Tyrants, and Trigons be even more effective and able to play the game plan that the faction is so good at right now. As much as I have nostalgia for the Horde mode Tyranids of taking a billion models or a bunch of Carnifexes and stuff like that, the 8th edition Codex Tyranids, which is much more focused on that hit and run style gameplay, is much more mechanically interesting to me, and that's what would keep me invested over the long term of playing the faction. In addition, we'd also like to see some faction-specific upgrades, things like secondary objectives. We did get one in Warzone Knockmoons, but it is not very good. We also see factions getting unique resource mechanics, which I'd like to see. Maybe the ability for units to adapt when they kill models or when they're attacked by models, or potentially generating some sort of resource when they kill enemies in melee, you know, gaining their biomass for use later on in the game could be interesting. We already see mechanics like this from Adeptus Sororitas with their Miracle Dice. We're seeing these resource-style mechanics being built into each faction individually, with things like Thousand Suns Cabal points or the new Foresight dice from the updated Craft Worlds Codex, and I'd like to see that expanded for an interesting Tyranids mechanic as well. Anyway, that's all I have to say about the updated Tyranid Codex. Regardless of my level of desire for a new Tyranids Codex, I am excited to get a new one and be able to experiment with a whole host of new abilities and subfactions and all that stuff. Obviously, stay tuned. I'll be talking about any new previews or leaks that come out for a new Tyranid Codex, because I will not be able to help myself talking about them. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks to everyone who supports the channel over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Also, YouTube channel members, you can join the link down below. Twitch subscribers, all you people are phenomenal. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.